The marble columns of the Vailonian royal palace gleamed like captured moonlight, their surfaces carved with intricate patterns that told the history of a civilization that had reached for the stars while never forgetting the beauty of home. Sergeant David Thompson stood at attention in his dress uniform, one of a dozen human peacekeepers serving as honor guard for the Treaty of Three Worlds signing ceremony, trying not to gawk at the assembled dignitaries like a tourist at his first alien cultural exchange. The Vailonians were an elegant people, tall and graceful with pale luminescent skin that seemed to glow from within. Their cranial ridges pulsed with soft colors that David's cultural briefings had taught him indicated various emotional states, and their flowing ceremonial robes created an effect like watching living artwork move through the grand hall. "Remember, Thompson," Lieutenant Rebecca Hayes whispered from her position beside him, "we're here to look impressive and keep our mouths shut. Try not to accidentally start a diplomatic incident." "When have I ever started a diplomatic incident?" David whispered back. "There was that thing with the Centauri ambassador and the misunderstood greeting gesture. That wasn't my fault. Nobody told me that pointing with your index finger means, I challenge you to ritual combat, in their culture." Their quiet banter was interrupted by a flourish of harmonic music that seemed to emanate from the palace walls themselves. The Vailonian royal family entered in formal procession, their movements synchronized to the rhythm of their traditional coronation march. King Valtherion walked with the measured pace of someone who had ruled for decades, his cranial ridges glowing with the steady blue that indicated calm authority. Beside him, Queen Miraleth moved with liquid grace, her own ridges cycling through the warm gold tones that marked deep contentment. But it was the small figure walking between them that caught David's attention. Prince Kaelin, heir to the Vailonian throne, was 6 years old by human standards and possessed the same luminescent skin as his parents, though his cranial ridges were still developing and glowed with the bright, rapidly changing colors that marked childhood emotions. He wore miniature royal robes that managed to be both adorable and dignified, and his large eyes took in everything around him with the curious intensity that seemed universal among children regardless of species. The ceremony proceeded with the kind of elaborate formality that made David grateful for his military training in standing perfectly still for extended periods. Representatives from Earth, Vaelonia, and the Centauri Republic took turns making speeches about cooperation, mutual benefit, and the bright future that awaited their allied civilizations. David was mentally reviewing the lunch menu from the mess hall when the explosion shattered the ceremonial harmony. The blast came from somewhere in the upper galleries, sending chunks of marble and crystalline debris raining down on the assembled dignitaries. David's military training kicked in automatically: assess, prioritize, act. The bomb had been placed to maximize casualties among the royal family and foreign delegates, turning what should have been a celebration of peace into a massacre. Through the smoke and screaming, David saw King Valtherion's form lying motionless beneath a fallen column, his cranial ridges dark and still. Queen Miraleth was trapped under debris, her golden light fading as alien blood pooled beneath the rubble. But moving through the chaos with the panicked confusion of a terrified child was Prince Kaelin, his small form stumbling toward where his parents lay buried. David didn't think. He ran. The second explosion erupted just as he reached the prince, and David threw himself forward, covering the child's body with his own as superheated marble fragments and twisted metal rained down around them. Something heavy struck his back with enough force to drive the breath from his lungs, and he felt the sharp pain of debris cutting through his dress uniform to score the flesh beneath. When the thunder finally stopped and the dust began to settle, David found himself lying in a crater that had once been the ceremonial dais, his body wrapped protectively around a small alien child who was sobbing in perfect standard, "Mama. Papa. Where are Mama and Papa?" "I've got you," David whispered, checking the prince for injuries and finding only minor cuts and bruises. "You're safe. I've got you." The emergency response was swift and professional, but David could see from the medic's expressions that King Valtherion and Queen Miraleth were beyond help. As they worked to stabilize his own injuries, 3 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and numerous lacerations, David kept one hand on Prince Kaelin's small shoulder, providing what comfort he could to a child whose world had just been destroyed. "The prince needs to be moved to a secure location," announced Captain Velstrand of the Royal Guard, his cranial ridges cycling through the red patterns that indicated anger and determination. There may be additional threats. No. Kalen's voice cut through the organized chaos like a blade. His small hands clutched at David's uniform jacket, his ridges blazing with the purple-white of absolute terror. Don't leave me. Please don't leave me. David looked into the child's eyes, large and luminous and filled with the kind of loss that no 6-year-old should have to carry. And felt something fundamental shift in his chest. I'm not going anywhere, Your Highness. I promise. Sergeant Thompson, Captain Velstrand said carefully, the prince needs to be cared for by Veolonian guardians who understand his cultural needs. The prince needs to be cared for by someone he trusts, David replied, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from battlefield experience. Right now, that's me. As the medical team finished treating his injuries, David found himself in the unique position of being a human soldier who had accidentally become the primary caretaker for an alien prince. It wasn't a role he'd trained for, but as he felt Kalen's small hand slip into his and saw the way the child's terror faded when he was close, David realized that some responsibilities chose you whether you were ready or not. What he didn't know was that 6 months later, when the political situation had stabilized enough for the Princess Aunt to return from her diplomatic mission, that simple promise would change everything for 3 lives and 2 civilizations. The temporary quarters assigned to David and Prince Kalen were luxurious by military standards but felt like a gilded cage when you were responsible for a traumatized alien child who woke up screaming every night. David had requested rooms in the palace's guest wing rather than the royal children's quarters, reasoning that Kalen needed stability more than ceremony, and the Regency Council had grudgingly agreed. He won't eat again, reported Dr. Velmira, the child psychologist who had been assigned to monitor Kalen's recovery. Her cranial ridges pulsed with the frustrated orange that indicated professional concern. This is the 3rd day he's refused traditional Veolonian foods. I'm worried about nutritional deficiencies. David looked across the room where Kalen sat curled in a chair, his small form wrapped in a blanket that had been a gift from the human delegation. The prince's ridges were cycling through the muted gray patterns that David had learned meant deep sadness, and his large eyes stared at nothing with the 1,000-yard stare that David recognized from his own military experience. What about human food? David suggested. He's been curious about my ration packs. Dr. Velmira's ridges flared with shocked blue. Sergeant Thompson, the prince cannot subsist on military rations. His developing physiology requires proper Veolonian nutrition. His developing physiology requires him to actually eat something, David replied, moving to kneel beside Kalen's chair. Your Highness, are you hungry? I've got some of those protein bars you liked yesterday. Kalen's ridges brightened slightly, the first color David had seen from him all day. The ones that taste like sweet flowers. Strawberry flavor, David confirmed, pulling one from his pack. But you have to eat some real food too, okay? Dr. Velmira is worried about you. As Kalen nibbled on the protein bar, his ridges gradually shifting to healthier colors, David caught Dr. Velmira studying their interaction with professional interest. You've learned to read his emotional patterns, she observed. Most humans find our chromatic communication difficult to interpret. Most humans don't spend 18 hours a day with a Veolonian 6-year-old, David replied. You pick things up. What he didn't mention was how much he'd grown to care about those color changes, how Kalen's rare moments of happiness, marked by bright gold ridges, had become the highlight of David's days. The prince was brilliant, curious, and surprisingly resilient when he felt safe, but the trauma of losing his parents had left him clinging to the one stable relationship in his shattered world. The Regency Council is concerned about the prince's attachment, Dr. Velmira continued carefully. Some members feel that his dependency on human companionship might interfere with his cultural development. David felt a familiar chill of anxiety. And what do you think, Doctor? I think, she replied, watching as Kalen finished his protein bar and moved to sit beside David on the floor, that Prince Kalen is healing remarkably well considering the magnitude of his trauma. His language development is accelerating, his curiosity is returning, and his night terrors have decreased significantly since you became his primary caregiver. But? David prompted, sensing there was more. But the political situation is becoming complicated. The prince's aunt, Queen Lireleth, is returning from her diplomatic mission next week. She'll want to assume guardianship of her nephew, and she may not approve of the unconventional arrangements that have developed in her absence. That evening, after Kaelin had fallen asleep clutching a stuffed animal that the palace fabricators had created based on a human teddy bear design, David found himself walking the palace gardens and thinking about futures he'd never planned for. He'd enlisted in the military to see the galaxy, maybe make a difference in some small way. He'd never expected to become a surrogate father to an alien prince. Penny for your thoughts. Lieutenant Hayes joined him on the garden path, offering him a cup of coffee from the human delegation's private stash. Just wondering what happens when Queen Lireleth gets here, David replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. Kaelin's been asking about his aunt, but he doesn't remember her very well. She's been off-world for most of his life. And you're worried she'll see you as a temporary convenience that's outlived its usefulness, Rebecca guessed. I'm worried she'll see me as a threat, David corrected. Think about it. A foreign soldier who's somehow become the most important person in the heir's life. From her perspective, I'm either incredibly suspicious or incredibly dangerous. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee and watching the bioluminescent plants that lined the garden paths pulse with their own gentle light. You know, she said finally, there's a third possibility you're not considering. Which is? That she'll see you as the person who saved her nephew's life and helped him heal from the worst trauma imaginable. Rebecca turned to face him directly. David, I've watched you with that kid for 6 months. You're not playing politics or trying to gain influence. You're just being the father he needs. Maybe that's all she'll see too. David wanted to believe that, but he'd seen enough of palace politics to know that good intentions didn't always translate to good outcomes. Still, when he returned to their quarters and found Kaelin sleeping peacefully for once, his ridges glowing with the soft green that indicated happy dreams, David allowed himself to hope that maybe Rebecca was right. After all, what was the worst that could happen when a warrior queen met the human who had accidentally become her nephew's father figure? 5 days later, as David helped Kaelin practice his standard vocabulary, the answer to that question would arrive with all the subtlety of a diplomatic earthquake. Queen Lireleth's arrival at the palace was announced by the kind of fanfare usually reserved for visiting heads of state or the second coming of deity figures. David stood with Prince Kaelin in the great reception hall, watching through the massive transparent steel windows as the Queen's flagship descended through Lyros Prime's atmosphere like a silver comet trailing fire. Is that Aunt Lyra's ship? Kaelin asked, his cranial ridges cycling through excited yellows and nervous purples as he pressed his small hands against the window. That's her ship, David confirmed, though he was having trouble reconciling the massive warship with his mental image of a loving aunt coming to collect her nephew. The vessel was clearly military-grade, bristling with weapons arrays and defensive systems that spoke of someone who expected trouble wherever she went. She's been gone a long time, Kaelin continued, his ridges shifting to the deeper blues that David had learned indicated sadness. I don't remember her very well. David knelt beside the prince, straightening the formal robes that protocol demanded for royal family reunions. That's okay, Your Highness. Sometimes it takes time to remember people we haven't seen for a while. But she's your family, and she loves you very much. What David didn't say was that Queen Lireleth had been conducting military campaigns on the frontier for 5 years, establishing Vaelonian dominance over contested systems through a combination of superior firepower and ruthless tactical brilliance. Her reputation as the Iron Rose of the Outer Worlds suggested someone who prioritized duty over sentiment and results over relationships. The royal escort arrived precisely on schedule, a column of Vaelonian guards in ceremonial armor whose cranial ridges were locked in the disciplined neutral tones that indicated military formality. At their head walked Queen Lireleth herself, and David immediately understood why her enemies called her the Iron Rose. She was tall even by Vaelonian standards, her luminescent skin marked with the ritual scarification of a proven war leader. Her cranial ridges were more pronounced than her deceased brothers had been, pulsing with the steady silver that indicated absolute self-control. But it was her eyes that caught David's attention, pale violet and ancient despite her relatively young age, holding the kind of weariness that came from making too many hard decisions in too many dark places. "Prince Kaelin," she said formally, stopping before them with military precision. "I am Queen Lireleth Velfasara, your father's sister and your regent until you reach the age of ascension." Kaelin's ridges flickered with nervous purple as he performed the formal bow that David had spent weeks teaching him. "Aunt Lyra," he said carefully in Vaelonian, then added in Standard, "I remember your voice from the communication calls." David caught the slight tightening around Queen Lireleth's eyes at the use of Standard, though her expression remained formally neutral. Her gaze shifted to him with the kind of assessment that made him feel like he was being evaluated for combat readiness. "Sergeant Thompson," she said, her accent making his name sound strange and foreign. "I have read the reports of your actions during the attack. The Vaelonian people owe you a debt of gratitude." "I was just doing my job, Your Majesty," David replied, falling back on military formality. "Any soldier would have done the same." "Would they?" Queen Lireleth's pale violet eyes seemed to see right through him. "The reports indicate you sustained significant injuries protecting my nephew, then remained as his caretaker during his recovery despite having no obligation to do so. That suggests dedication beyond mere duty." Before David could respond, one of the Regency Council members approached with the kind of careful deference that indicated he was about to deliver news nobody wanted to hear. "Your Majesty," Lord Velcaster said, his ridges cycling through apologetic oranges, "we should discuss the prince's living arrangements. The temporary guardian situation will need to be adjusted, now that you've returned." Queen Lireleth nodded curtly. "Indeed. Prince Kaelin will be moving to the royal quarters immediately. Proper tutors will be assigned to resume his education in Vaelonian history, culture, and statecraft." David felt his heart sink as he saw Kaelin's ridges flash to the bright red that meant panic. The prince's small hand immediately found his, gripping with the desperate strength of a child who sensed his world was about to change again. "Your Majesty," David said carefully, "perhaps the transition could be gradual. Prince Kaelin has been through significant trauma, and sudden changes to his routine tend to trigger anxiety responses." Queen Lireleth's expression didn't change, but David caught the way her ridges flickered briefly to orange before returning to controlled silver. "Sergeant Thompson, I appreciate your concern for my nephew's welfare, but he is the heir to the Vaelonian throne. He needs to learn our ways, not become further attached to alien customs." "I like alien customs," Kaelin said suddenly, his small voice carrying clearly in the formal hall. "David teaches me earth songs and tells me stories about humans who fix things instead of breaking them." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. David could see the assembled courtiers exchanging glances, their ridges cycling through colors that suggested they were witnessing something unprecedented and possibly scandalous. Queen Lireleth knelt to her nephew's level, her expression softening slightly. "Kaelin, you are Vaelonian royalty. You have responsibilities to your people that require proper education and training." "But I want to stay with David," Kaelin replied, his ridges now blazing with the stubborn gold that David had learned meant the prince had made up his mind about something. "He saved me from the bad people and takes care of me when I have nightmares. He's my—" The prince stopped mid-sentence, looking up at David with an expression of sudden clarity. When he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of absolute certainty that only children possessed. "He's my father now." The great hall fell silent except for the soft harmonic humming of the palace's bioluminescent systems. Every ridge in the room had gone completely still, locked in whatever color they'd been displaying when the prince spoke. David felt as though someone had just announced that gravity had been repealed and everyone was waiting to see if they would start floating. Queen Lireleth stared at her nephew for a long moment, her own ridges cycling through colors David had never seen before. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Kaelin, what did you say?" The prince looked confused by the adult reaction to what he clearly considered a simple statement of fact. "David is my father," he repeated, moving closer to David's side. "He protects me and teaches me things and makes the scary dreams go away. That's what fathers do." David found himself at the center of a silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. Every eye in the hall was fixed on him, waiting to see how he would respond to a declaration that had just redefined his relationship with Vailonian royalty in the most public way possible. "Your Majesty," he said to Queen Lireleth, his voice steadier than he felt, "I think we need to talk." The private meeting in Queen Lireleth's study was one of the most uncomfortable conversations of David's life, and he'd once had to explain to his commanding officer why he'd accidentally blown up a fuel depot during routine maintenance. The queen sat behind an elegant desk that seemed to have grown from the palace floor, her cranial ridges locked in the steady silver of absolute control, while Prince Kaelin played quietly in the corner with building blocks that responded to his touch by forming complex geometric patterns. "Sergeant Thompson," Queen Lireleth began, her voice carrying the kind of formal authority that made David want to stand at attention, "explain to me how a human soldier became my nephew's primary attachment figure." David had been preparing for this conversation for weeks, but sitting across from the legendary Iron Rose of the Outer Worlds made all his rehearsed explanations feel inadequate. "Your Majesty, after the attack, Prince Kaelin was in severe psychological distress. The medical staff felt that maintaining continuity of care with someone he trusted was more important than following standard protocols. And you volunteered for this responsibility?" "The prince wouldn't let anyone else near him," David replied honestly. "I was there when it happened, I helped get him to safety, and for whatever reason, he decided I was trustworthy. The doctors said forcing a separation could cause additional trauma." Queen Lireleth's pale violet eyes studied him with an intensity that made David feel like she was reading his service record directly from his brain. "The reports indicate you've been remarkably dedicated to his care. Teaching him your language, sharing your cultural traditions, providing emotional support through his grief process. He's a good kid, Your Majesty. Brilliant, curious, braver than most adults I know. He deserved someone who would take his recovery seriously. Even though caring for him meant putting your own career on hold. Your military superiors were expecting you to return to active duty months ago." David glanced at Kaelin, who had built something that looked like a miniature palace and was now making small figures walk through its corridors. "Some things are more important than career advancement." Queen Lireleth followed his gaze, and David saw her expression soften almost imperceptibly as she watched her nephew play. "He seems healthier than I expected." The reports from immediately after the attack described severe withdrawal, refusal to communicate, chronic night terrors. "He still has nightmares sometimes," David admitted. "But he started talking about his parents without breaking down, he's curious about learning new things, and he laughs again. That's progress. Progress achieved through attachment to a human guardian rather than proper Vailonian therapeutic protocols," the Queen observed, though her tone held more curiosity than criticism. "With respect, Your Majesty, Prince Kaelin tried the Vailonian therapeutic protocols. They weren't working. He needed someone who could provide unconditional stability while he figured out how to keep living in a world that had suddenly become terrifying." Queen Lireleth was quiet for a long moment, her ridges cycling through colors David couldn't interpret. "Sergeant Thompson, do you understand the political implications of what my nephew declared in the throne room?" "I understand that it's complicated," David replied carefully. "It's unprecedented," Queen Lireleth corrected. "A member of the royal family has never claimed a non-Vailonian as family before. The legal ramifications alone are staggering. Questions of succession rights, cultural preservation, the precedent for future interspecies relationships." David felt his stomach sink. "Your Majesty, I never intended." "I know," she interrupted, her voice gentler than he'd heard it since her arrival. "But intentions and consequences are different things. The question now is what we do about the situation we find ourselves in." Before David could respond, Kaelin appeared at his elbow, having abandoned his building blocks in favor of joining the adult conversation. His ridges were cycling through curious greens as he looked between David and his aunt. "Aunt Lyra," he said in careful standard, "are you going to take me away from David?" Queen Lyraletha's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly as she looked into her nephew's large, trusting eyes. "Kaelin, I'm your family. Your real family." "David is my family too," Kaelin replied with the absolute certainty that only children could muster. "He takes care of me and reads me stories and makes funny voices for all the characters. And when I'm scared, he sings me the Earth song about the twinkle stars." "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," David corrected automatically, then caught Queen Lyraletha's amused glance. "It's a traditional human lullaby." "I see," the Queen said, and David could see her struggling with emotions she'd probably been trained to suppress. "Kaelin, would you like David to visit you sometimes? After you move to the royal quarters?" Kaelin's ridges flashed to the bright red of alarm. "No. I want to stay with David. Please, Aunt Lyra, don't make me go away from him." The desperation in the child's voice hit Queen Lyraletha like a physical blow. David watched as her rigid control finally gave way, her ridges cycling through pain and uncertainty and something that might have been recognition. "Kaelin," she said softly, "I don't want to hurt you. I just want what's best for you." "David is what's best for me," Kaelin replied, moving to stand between them. "He keeps me safe and makes me feel better, and he promised he wouldn't leave me." Queen Lyraletha looked at David over her nephew's head, her expression holding a question he wasn't sure how to answer. "Is that true, Sergeant? Did you promise you wouldn't leave him?" "Yes, Your Majesty," David replied without hesitation. "And I meant it." The Queen was quiet for a long time, her ridges cycling through colors that suggested she was working through a complex decision matrix. Finally, she spoke. "The law provides for exceptional circumstances in matters of royal guardianship," she said slowly. "When the heir's well-being requires unconventional arrangements, the Crown may designate co-regents to serve until the heir reaches majority." David felt his breath catch. "Your Majesty, I am proposing to make you Kaelin's official co-guardian," Queen Lyraletha continued, her voice gaining strength as she committed to the decision. "You would remain his primary caretaker while I handle the political aspects of his regency. It's unprecedented, but then, so is everything else about this situation." Kaelin's ridges exploded into brilliant gold as he threw his arms around both adults simultaneously. "Really? David can stay forever?" "Really," Queen Lyraletha confirmed, and David caught the genuine smile that transformed her stern features as she watched her nephew's joy. "Though I suspect, forever, is going to require some very interesting legal paperwork." 15 years later, David stood in the same throne room where Kaelin had first called him father, watching as the young king received his coronation crown from the hands of his aunt. Kaelin was tall and graceful now, his ridges glowing with the confident gold of a ruler who had learned to balance wisdom with compassion, tradition with innovation. "Any regrets, Dad?" Kaelin asked quietly in standard, using the term that had become natural between them over the years. David looked at the young man who had grown from a traumatized child into a leader capable of bridging worlds, then at Queen Lyraletha, who had become not just his co-parent but one of his closest friends. Their unconventional family had weathered political storms, cultural challenges, and the growing pains of raising a child destined to rule an interstellar civilization. "Just one," David replied, as he always did. "I wish your parents could see the man you've become." Kaelin's ridges glowed with warm affection as he placed his hand on David's shoulder. "They can see, Dad. And I think they're proud of the family we built together." As the coronation ceremony began and King Kaelin took his place on the throne that had been empty for too long, David reflected on the strange path that had brought them all here. He'd come to Lyro's prime as a soldier, but he was leaving as something much more important, a father, a bridge between species, and living proof that love could transcend any boundary when the need was great enough. The marble hall filled with harmonious music as the new king began his reign, and David Thompson, former sergeant, accidental guardian, and proud father of an alien king, smiled as he watched his son take the first steps toward a future built on the foundation of an impossible family that had somehow become the most natural thing in the world.